welcome everybody. Wanju, and welcome to this lovely night, a spring night here down at Willow at Fremantle Arts Centre. My name's Glenn Issachar-Pilkington. I'm the curator of visual arts here at the Arts Centre, and I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet at Wallpaper tonight on Wajak Noongar Budja and pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and young leaders who care for this country, its ancient story, and generously share this place with us. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Wajak Noongar Budja. I'd just like to acknowledge our major supporters before we start this evening, the Department of Local Government, Sports and Creative Industries, the City of Fremantle and the Australia Council for the Arts. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do, so we're very, very grateful. So this is our evening of disclosure. It's a night of ideas and discourse and an increasingly popular event here at the Arts Centre. It's the third disclosure this year, and we're really thrilled to have artist and curator Andrew Nicholls here this evening. Andrew is the guest curator of A Gentle Misinterpretation, one of our major exhibitions for this, our third quarter of the year. And he will be giving us some insight this evening into chinoiserie and its legacy for artists living and working in Australia. And the exhibition he's curated with 13 artists that either have lived in Australia, continue to live here, or have a link to Western Australia. So this iteration, disclosure, is called Beg, Borrow and Steal, Appropriation and Chinoiserie. So Andrew, a little about him. He's an Australian-British artist, a writer and curator based in Boorloo, Western Australia. He's primarily drawing-based, and his practice also incorporates ceramics, photography, and expansive site-based curatorial projects. He particularly draws inspiration from heritage sites and museum collections and has coordinated group and solo residencies at numerous historic locations in Australia and the United Kingdom. Andrew has exhibited across Australia, Southeast Asia, Italy and in the UK, undertaking commissions for several organisations in Australia and in the United States. He has curated projects for organisations including the Art Gallery of Western Australia, the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts and Object Galleries in Sydney. His work is represented in collections including Art Bank, the Art Gallery of WA, the City of Perth, and I don't know how to say that one, Kadumba collection of Australian drawings. The Art Gallery of Western Australia showed his major solo from 2018 to 2019. So if we can all put your hands together and welcome Andrew to the stage, and he will kick us off with some really interesting discussions this evening. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I also pay my respect to the elders of the Wajak Noongar Nation, past, present and emerging. Also a bit of a content warning to begin with. I will be showing some imagery later in the presentation of some artworks that have been considered quite confronting and culturally insensitive, so I apologise in advance for that. This presentation will be in two parts. Firstly, I'm going to discuss chinoiserie, which was the thematic background to the exhibition. The second part will be about appropriation in the arts more broadly. Glenn, how do I use the clicker? Oh, turning it on would help. Oh, here we go. Hurrah. Okay, I'm going to begin by telling you a story. Once upon a time, in an exotic faraway kingdom, lived Kung Se, the beautiful daughter of a wealthy mandarin. Kung Se was betrothed to an elderly but very wealthy merchant. However, she was in love with Chang, the bookkeeper of her father. When the mandarin found out about their illicit love affair, he banished Chang and built a great fence around his property to keep him out. Soon afterwards, the merchant arrived by boat, bringing with him a casket of jewels as a marriage offering. While the mandarin and the merchant got drunk at the celebratory wedding feast, Chang broke into the compound and escaped with Kung Se and the jewels. The mandarin, merchant, and one of his men gave chase, but the couple escaped, eventually settling happily on a faraway island where Chang became a successful writer. Unfortunately, his fame eventually reached the ears of the mandarin, who sent his henchmen to capture the couple. They killed Chang and set fire to the house, killing Kung Se, who was inside. The gods, because this kingdom had many gods, took pity on the couple and transformed them into 2 turtle doves. Before I discuss the provenance of this story, I just want you to think a bit about what we can tell about the culture that the story describes. Based on that narrative, we can tell it's a patriarchal society, it's misogynistic, brutalistic, money-grubbing, it values material possessions over emotional connection. It's feudal, and it's decadent. They got drunk at the wedding feast. And it's also obviously very kitsch and sentimentalist, this sort of storybook land that's very cutesy, yet violent and unpleasant. So for anyone who hasn't figured this out, this is one of the versions of the authentic Chinese legends that allegedly inspired the Willow pattern. So that story and variations on it were invented as a kind of marketing ploy by the British ceramics factory who invented the Willow pattern in the 18th century or early 19th century. And as a marketing ploy, it worked extremely well. Blue Willow is unquestionably the most popular China pattern the world has ever seen. It was so successful that Chinese factories had to start creating their own versions of it to meet the demand for it. So the starting point for the exhibition in the foyer space there is a piece of antique ceramic from my own collection, which is a shard of Chinese-made willow pattern china. So it was created in Jingdezhen in China as a replica of the English version, which was a replica of traditional Chinese motifs. So I wouldn't even like to hazard a guess for how many individual pieces of willow pattern have been created over the past 2 centuries. Easily millions, maybe tens or hundreds of millions. The pattern was created in 1790, late 18th century. It's never been out of production since that time, and multiple factories around the world have been producing it at any one time during those 2 centuries. We believe that it was actually invented by Thomas Turner at the Corley Pottery Works in Shropshire, which was under the management of Josiah Spode and William Copeland. And along with that story, there was also a poem that accompanied the design that was, or various poems that were equally as kind of sentimental and cloying, but tried to give it this kind of aura of authentic Asianness. So in 1999, Robert Copeland, who is one of the descendants of William, described British-made willow pattern and blue transferware china as gentle misinterpretations of Chinese culture. And I read that when I was in the UK in 2004, undertaking a residency, and I'd been quite shocked at that time to realise that willow wasn't an authentic Chinese pattern, because I'd always assumed it was. And knowing what I did then and still know about the foundations of the commercial ceramics industry in Britain, I knew that there was nothing gentle at all about the use of faux Chinese cultural motifs to make money. And the fact that it was one of William Copeland's descendants who was writing this made it feel kind of even more awkward and inappropriate. At the particular time that the willow pattern had been invented, ceramics production in the UK had only existed for about 50 years. Prior to that time, China had dominated the commercial ceramics industry for 1.5 millennia. So the kind of aping of Chinese iconography on this type of product was a very aggressive attempt on behalf of Britain to steal the market from Asia. And the exhibition talks a bit more about the economic circumstances and historical circumstances that informed that. I'll touch on it a bit later as well. So the exhibition is about chinoiserie. As I said, I'm going to begin just providing a very, very brief outline of the history of the genre. Chinoiserie basically refers to the European creation of faux Asian aesthetics in the arts, design and architecture. It became a fad in the late 17th century and reached its heights in Britain during the mid-18th century, but it has continued since then. It had a major resurgence, for example, during the Jazz Age in the early 20th century. It was initially utilised in garden design primarily, and one of the most iconic examples is this, the pagoda in Kew Gardens in London, which was designed by Sir William Chambers, but it soon went on to encompass all of the decorative arts. So for example, here we have these stunning Chippendale dining chairs, which I would give my left arm for. The first chinoiserie interior in Britain was a bedroom closet at Bolsover Castle in Derbyshire in 1616. That no longer exists, but this is an interior, and I cannot remember where it is. Hang on, Claydon House. This is the Chinese tea room in Claydon House. This is probably the second most important surviving example of chinoiserie interiors. The most important, of course, is the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, which was created largely. There was a small, fairly modest building there prior to George IV acquiring it, but it was George IV who turned it into this outrageously problematic yet fabulous example of chinoiserie that still exists today. It's the most important and most intact example of the style. It was created by George IV in various stages between 1787 and 1823, and it reflected his notoriously excessive tastes. Again, if you go through the exhibition and read the didactics, you'll get a sense of the character of George IV, who became very useful for those of us in the exhibition who are not of Asian ancestry, because he really becomes iconic of the voracious appetite of the British Empire during this period in terms of globalisation and the way that Britain was so obsessed with controlling and capturing as much wealth and as much kind of central excess as possible. Curiously, the Brighton Pavilion, by the time George ascended the throne, chinoiserie was actually out of fashion, and he was an extremely fashion-conscious monarch. He was also virulently heterosexual, so it's kind of unusual that he created such an icon of chinoiserie, because by that stage the genre not only was not particularly fashionable, but it was very much associated with women and women of ill repute, which again I'll talk about in a few moments. So yeah, it's quite a curious thing, but I think it just appealed to his voracious desire for sensual pleasure and excess in all its forms. By the time it was completed, we were well into the 19th century, and the opulence of this building was really in defiance of the kind of more prudish attitudes of society throughout the 1800s. We have a really amazing quote from one visitor who said, "I do not believe that since the days of Heliogabalus there has been such magnificence and such luxury. There is something effeminate about it which is disgusting. One spends the evening half lying on cushions. There are lights. The lights are dazzling. There are perfumes, music, liqueurs." The nod to Heliogabalus is really notable there, because this was an era, this is only a few years after the French Revolution, so there's a real sense in society that the excesses of the aristocracy were very problematic and quite dangerous, but George, being George IV, did not let that stand in his way. So I was lucky enough to visit the pavilion on the same residency I mentioned earlier. So around the same time as I read that quote from Robert Copeland, I visited this building, and the two kind of always stayed in my mind, and from that moment on I was determined to curate a project around this subject matter. And even though I was aware of how problematic the genre is, I was also really fascinated and entranced by it. So I approached the City of Brighton, who owned the building, and was able to organise a series of residencies which took place in 2015 for myself and a number of artists who at that time were all either based in WA or had recently left. I'll just show you a few images of the building, and you can see footage of the building in the exhibition. It sort of becomes more and more and more opulent as you move through the various spaces. This is the long gallery, and you'll see that this is one of the hand-painted wallpapers that we've recreated in the exhibition. This is upstairs, and again, this is the motif that we've used in the hallway of the show. This is the saloon. This space was actually in the process of being renovated when we were there, so it was all covered in scaffolding, but it now looks like this, and it's a recreation of what it looked like during the later stages of George's reign. What looks like wallpaper there is actually hand-applied platinum leaf. Like, they spared no expense in recapturing the splendour of this space. This is the banqueting hall. Food was integral to George and his approach to diplomacy, so this was one of the most important spaces in the building. This is the music room. Again, George, for all of his faults, was an incredible patron of the arts, and that included music. He commissioned major works to premiere in this space. It looked somewhat less magnificent than this when we were there, because these amazing 2.5 metre high pagodas that you can see were designed for this space, but then moved to Buckingham Palace by Queen Victoria. In 2020, our current Queen renovated a wing of Buckingham Palace and lent back around 200 objects that had been created at the pavilion. So this photo was taken there a couple of years ago and sort of restored what was already a magnificent space into this incredible, magnificent, opulent environment. And this is the royal kitchens. Again, it's kind of an indication of how important food was to George IV. Even the servants' quarters have this decorative scheme extending into them, and so you've got these amazing cast iron palm trees holding up the ceiling. And George would take guests to the kitchens and show them off, because when they were built, they were the best equipped kitchens in the British Isles. So we undertook a couple of residencies there. It was such a large group of artists that it was divided into two. So initially it was myself, Casey Ayres, Pilar Marta Dupont and Theo Costantino, and we're there with Alessandra Losk, one of the curators of the museum. The second residency was with Abdul Abdullah, Taryn Gill, Nathan Beard and David Charles Collins. They're talking to one of the master gilders. We were able to access the museum collection as well as the pavilion itself, and they've got a really incredible collection of a world art collection, and also a textiles collection and a fashion collection, which have fed into various works. For example, Nathan Beard's ceramics reference historical photographs from the museum collection. We were able to create works on site. This is me in the process of filming the video work you can see in the show. David with the horse that he rode through the grounds. That was the first time in several decades that a horse had been allowed on the premises. So the museum team were really excited by that, because George IV was such a fan of the equine pursuits and was himself a really impressive rider when he was slim enough to do so. There were also a couple of residencies in China that fed into this show. This is Nathan and Sandra when we were in Jingdezhen in 2016, in one of the many amazing factories that exist in that part of China, which was the kind of the homeland of porcelain globally for 1500 years up until the 18th century. And you can see in this factory they still mass produce not only Chinese deities but busts and figurines of Chairman Mao. And that's just me in my studio space in Jingdezhen. Sandra and I returned there a couple of times over the course of the development of the show. So I will quickly run through a couple of the stylistic motifs that I think make chinoiserie so fascinating and also so problematic from a cultural perspective. The exhibition didactics go into this in far more detail. So chinoiserie was marked by a kind of PanAsian cultural hybridity. There was limited geographical knowledge in the 18th century about anything that was further east than Greece. So chinoiserie tended to conflate anything east of that point into one sort of PanAsian blob, which of course makes it highly culturally insensitive. So you see anything from sort of Chinese, Indian, Japanese, Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern, Egyptian culture kind of blended together into this strange hybrid. And it would also mix together Eastern and Western motifs. So this was a teapot that I photographed from the museum collection in Brighton, and you can see that it has Chinese scenes around the edges, but the handle, the spout and the lid have an acorn and oak leaves on them. Similarly, the second most popular ceramics design in the world is Spode's Blue Italian, which has been very important to me throughout my career, and I had a whole other exhibition about that China pattern at Agua a couple of years ago, but this was notable for having this kind of bucolic Italian pastoral scene in the centre and then a faux Asian border around it that was sort of loosely based on Japanese amari ware. And again, much like the Willow pattern, this was an incredibly popular design, and literally millions upon millions of pieces of china currently exist and have existed in the world in the last 2 centuries. Asymmetry and disorder also marked chinoiserie. It existed much like the Rococo and the Gothic. Chinoiserie emerged in direct opposition to neoclassicism, which had been the dominant aesthetic language up until that point. This was an era, as I mentioned before, when Britain was really aspiring for world domination, very successfully as it happened, and they were modelling themselves on the Roman Empire. And the language of the Roman Empire was the language of classicism, formal perspective, balance, and so on. So chinoiserie kind of reflects this loosening of these kind of very strict aesthetic and social structures within society. So you can see, for example, here a mirror. This is actually a 19th century reconstruction of an 18th century mirror created in the style of Chippendale, but you can see the sort of asymmetry there. Not only did this signify a kind of relaxing of the rules of society, but it was very much coded as being primitive and somehow more pure than Western culture, which again is kind of nice in some ways because it sort of nods to some kind of ancient cultural superiority and longevity, but is also highly patronising. So chinoiserie through these kind of motifs of asymmetry was cast as primitive and somehow pure, but also dangerously sort of sensual and unbalanced. Architect and garden designer Sir William Temple described chinoiserie as beauty without order. And you see that in this kind of design. William Morris, another architect, was more critical when he said that chinoiserie comprised of nothing other than mere whims and chimera without rules or order. It requires no fertility of genius to put into execution. And as to serpents, dragons, monkeys, and etc., they, like the rest of the beauties, may be cut in paper and pasted anywhere. Related to that is this idea of kind of visual flatness, which you see in the Willow pattern, where it all seems to be happening on kind of one picture plane, and there's that incredibly iconic fence running across the bottom of the image, which is kind of 3D rendered in 2 dimensions. And again, it was seen as very oriental for things to be very flat. There was a lot of 2-dimensional wallpaper coming out of China at the time that was very fashionable. And similarly, it sort of has this idea of purity and simplicity that is quite offensive and patronising. Somewhat less offensive, but I think something that makes chinoiserie really fun, and part of the reason why I love it so much is this idea of mimicry and illusion. When chinoiserie became popular, there were decorative objects coming out of China that were extremely luxurious, high-end luxury goods, things like, well, tea, but silk, lacquerware, porcelain, obviously, shagreen, which was stingray leather. And no one in Europe knew how to make this stuff. They sort of figured it out over time. But part of chinoiserie involved European artisans being commissioned to create something that looked like those objects. So, for example, this is a shot from the top of the stairs of the pavilion. The LED lighting there is hand-painted. It's not actual LED lighting. The wallpaper is hand-painted. It's not actual silk wallpaper. But the building has these incredible staircases, and there are two of them, one at each end of this huge long gallery. They look like they're made out of bamboo, but they're actually cast iron. And you can see here in one of my photographs that didn't end up in the show. Hopefully you can see the detail here. It's cast iron, but it's been painted to look like bamboo, and it even has these like knots painted on it, wooden knots. And another one of my favourite details from the building, even some of the wood grain in the building is hand painted. So this is the reverse of the doors in the red drawing room, and it has these dragons hidden in the wood grain of the doors. So again, slightly less culturally offensive and more on the fun end of the spectrum. Okay, so the historical context for chinoiserie is something, especially the economic history of the genre is something we've tried to highlight in the show. And we were, because of the importance of the Royal Pavilion in the history of the genre, we were able to really focus on George IV as a character and as kind of an icon of this voracious appetite of the British Empire during the 18th century. However, chinoiserie reached its heyday before George, during the reign of George III, his father. This is a caricature from that era of the McCarthy embassy to China. It was the first official English envoy to China, which took place in 1793. The context for this was that, as I mentioned before, there were these incredibly desirable luxury goods coming out of China that everyone in Europe and America wanted. China had no interest and no need to import anything from the rest of the world. At that time, the global currency was silver, which was acquired from the South Americas and was itself a legacy of the incredibly brutal Spanish colonization of the South Americas. So Western Europe and particularly Britain were hemorrhaging silver into China, and China was not giving any silver back. So George III sent McCarthy, who you can see genuflecting here, to go and basically try and charm the Chinese emperor into accepting British imports to kind of balance the economic scale. This is a very iconic moment in the history of British foreign relations, because infamously McCarthy refused to kowtow to the emperor. Kowtowing is like the full bow to the floor, which you can see some of his diplomats doing behind him. Probably a bit more has been made of this historically than was actually the case. It seems now academics are kind of saying it wasn't as big a deal as it was made out to be over the past couple of hundred years, but it was still very much a misstep on behalf of British foreign relations. And it's a really great example of just these two immovable cultural paradigms that met at this moment. McCarthy had said he would kowtow if the emperor was willing to genuflect to a portrait of George III, because from his perspective, both of the monarchs were equals. From the Chinese perspective, the emperor was a deity and was directly related to the gods. So of course, from their perspective, he was not the equal of George III, he was far above him. So McCarthy refused to kowtow. Instead, he genuflected, which is what he would have done when meeting his own monarch. And as a result, as I said, it wasn't as huge a diplomatic disaster as it's been made out historically, but still wasn't great and did not achieve what it was meant to. So the emperor's response to George III, I think, is a fantastic lesson in kind of diplomatic fuck-youery, when he said, "Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce." This did not go down well with George III, who, let us not forget, had lost the Americas 15 years prior. So from an economic perspective, he wasn't doing well during his reign. Britain's response, I still think, is one of the most shockingly brutal and revolting acts in history, they began the wholesale manufacture and sale of opium into China. It was grown in the British colonies in India, and it was done with the agenda of getting as many Chinese people addicted to the drug as possible so that China would have no choice but to buy something from Britain. And it worked extremely well. The social ramifications of that are beyond the scope of anything I could really discuss. China then tried to ban opium, and the result was the Opium Wars, which took place between 1839 and 1842. By that stage, we're into the Victorian era, so both of the Georges were dead. But China basically suffered a string of quite humiliating defeats and had to agree to anything that the West demanded from them. So all of that is kind of the context that chinoiserie emerged from and existed in. However, in the context of this lecture, I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting that China was some kind of victim in all of this. They didn't come out of the Opium Wars well. But I think it's important to keep in mind the cultural prowess that China had in the British and European consciousness that also fed into the chinoiserie movement. So it can be argued that chinoiserie reflected, obviously chinoiserie reflected high levels of insecurity and paranoia on behalf of the West regarding this incredibly powerful nation that existed on the other side of the world. So in The Chinese Taste in 18th Century England, academic David Porter states that knowledge about a foreign culture, and one that appeared neither in classical sources nor the Bible, stamped the European imagination with the indelible and deeply transformative awareness that there existed on the far end of the globe a highly advanced civilization with a rich and unbroken cultural heritage of over 4,000 years. And that if cultural diffusion was taking place between England and China, or more broadly between East Asia and Western Europe during this period, its dominant flows were clearly not in the direction that we're accustomed to imagining. England, when viewed from within a global macroeconomic perspective, occupied a rather peripheral position in what, until 1800 or so, was a largely Sinocentric world trade system. Sinocentric meaning focused around China. And this is what fascinates me so much about the 18th century, is that up until the 18th century, and well, certainly at the end of the 17th century, Britain was as far from being a world superpower as can be imagined. As a nation, they had committed the cardinal sin that any nation could commit during the 17th century. They committed regicide through the assassination of Charles I. So from the perspective of the rest of Europe, Britain was this miserable, rainy island full of barbarians somewhere to the north. London during this period was described as the cesspit of Europe. They were completely disregarded and down for the count and had absolutely no cachet globally at all. The fact that they were then able to transform themselves in less than 100 years into the greatest and most powerful empire the world has ever known, bar none, I'm not saying is a good thing. It was quite a horrendous thing, and we're still living with the fallout from that. But I find it very fascinating, and it's why much of my work focuses on that period. And again, it's very much the context that chinoiserie needs to be read within. We know why and how Britain achieved that. It was on the back of the rest of the world and from exploiting and draining the resources of every foreign nation that it could. And again, chinoiserie is kind of a really useful aesthetic metaphor in which to discuss that history and sort of think about the ramifications of it. Prior to this period, the dominant world powers were Spain in Europe and really the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese dynasties. To quote Gerald MacLean, discussing notions of the East, by which he means China and the Ottomans, during the 16th and 17th centuries, English writers never forgot that they were dealing with an empire that controlled a great deal of Eastern Europe and a third of the world, the known world, not a backward, vulnerable and somehow orientalised space waiting to be conquered and controlled. So if anything, even though China and Asia in general is kind of patronised through chinoiserie, I think the genre takes on quite a sinister aspect as it rolls out across the ensuing centuries in how it was kind of how it was perceived by the people who were consuming it. Firstly, it was cast as kind of grotesque and a novelty in opposition to neoclassicism. It then becomes seen as something quite trivial, some of those quotes I mentioned before where architects were very disparaging about it. Then it becomes increasingly to be considered decadent and immoral. So I kind of think as England and her allies begin to really dominate China in particular and Asia more broadly from an economic perspective via quite immoral means, highly immoral means through the opium trade, chinoiserie becomes this sort of distorted mirror whereby Britain could convince itself that it was Asia and not Britain that was kind of the immoral global force. And you see that reflected in the aesthetic materials from that time. For example, this is a Hogarth painting from his series Marriage à la Mode. Hogarth was a painter who specialised in moral art. So prior to this series, he'd created a Harlot's Progress and a Rake's Progress, two series of moralising canvases. And this was the third one, Marriage à la Mode, which kind of critiqued the idea of arranged marriages and marrying for money. This is the second work from the series where we see the young bride and groom. The first painting has their marriage being arranged. Here we see them, it's called Marriage à la Mode, the tête-à-tête or shortly after the marriage. So in this canvas we can see the young bride is looking quite dissolute and amorous and kind of looking quite coquettishly at the viewer. She has a hand mirror, so she could be signalling a lover who's hidden somewhere in the room. The groom to her left is looking exhausted. He's clearly been out all night. There's a broken sword at his feet, so he's been out fighting. That's also maybe a symbol of his lack of prowess as a husband. The dog is pulling a woman's cap out of his pocket, suggesting that he's been out in the midst of an affair. The servants are cleaning up the house, which is a mess. There are cards on the floor. The wife has obviously had a rowdy night of gambling. The servant on this side of the canvas has a stack of unpaid debts in his hand. And we can see behind them on the mantelpiece an arrangement of Chinese porcelains. Similarly, a number of cartoons from Punch, which was the great satirical publication of the day. Here's a mother devastated over the fact that she smashed her beloved Chinese teacup or teapot, and her daughter's sort of begging her, saying, the mother's saying she has nothing to live for, and the daughter's saying, but you've got me, and the mother's like, but you're a complete set. That piece of ceramic was a one-off. Similarly here on the left, a husband begging his wife to let him hold the teapot for a while because she's had it all day. The one on the right is particularly sinister. We've got the bridegroom there, who is clearly a caricature of Oscar Wilde, saying, so the aesthetic bridegroom is saying, "It is quite consummate, is it not?" And then the bride is saying, "Oh, Algernon, let us try and live up to it." Algernon, of course, was one of the main characters of The Importance of Being Earnest. And this cartoon refers to one of Oscar Wilde's bon mots, where he said in one of his essays that, "I find it harder and harder to live up to my blue china." So referencing the kind of overly sentimental and perfect imagery on the chinoiserie ceramics of the time. However, this becomes particularly sinister when you think about the fact that that particular quote was used as evidence of Wilde's immoral character during his trial. So he ended up being convicted to 3 years of hard labour and eventually died as a result of that trial. So again, you see chinoiserie here kind of becoming increasingly seen as something signifying some kind of moral decay. All at the same time as Britain is making money from peddling a drug in China that was actually illegal in England at the time. So that was an introduction to some of the more problematic aspects of chinoiserie, and God, I'm way over time. I will try and talk. Please leave if you're bored. I will talk now more generally about appropriation in the arts. So artists referencing the art that came before them, of course, has been commonplace throughout the history of Western art and globally. Much of the rest of the world and the decorative arts within the Western context have been largely modelled on the apprentice and master model for much of the last several millennia. In fact, when I first went to Jingdezhen in 2016, I gave a lecture on my chinoiserie research, and I kind of expected that the Chinese students I was lecturing to would be outraged by the appropriation and the very offensive treatment of their cultural material. And no one was really that bothered, and some of the students said to me afterwards, like, that's what we do, that's what we've always done. The model in Jingdezhen, certainly for the last 2,000 years, has been to become an apprentice and literally copy what your master has done, and your master would have spent his early career copying what the people before him had done. However, in the history of Western art, appropriation and referencing the artists who came before you is commonplace. So just as one example, some artworks that I really love personally. This is a detail from a fresco from Herculaneum in Naples, one of the great archaeological sites that was unearthed in the 18th century. This is Heracles finding his son Telephas from the early 2nd century AD. This is Ingres's Madame Moitissier, his second portrait of Madame Moitissier, created between 1844 and 1856, where he directly referenced that figure from the fresco. And then Cindy Sherman's version of it, loose version of it, Untitled 204 from 1989. This is just one of countless examples of artists referencing the art that came before them. And this is something that's really marked Western art for the past, certainly 100 years or so. In the early 20th century, obviously, we have Duchamp's ready-mades, Max Ernst's collages, Warhol and the pop artists in the mid-20th century, and then postmodernism with artists like Jeff Koons, post-postmodernism with artists like Luke Timons. It's not overly problematic from an ethical perspective, obviously, because it's artists referencing their own cultural lineage. However, issues of copyright and ownership come into play. And there have been a string of major lawsuits and plagiarism cases against many of the artists I just mentioned: Andy Warhol, Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, Luke Timons, Richard Prince. Interestingly, the really well-known cases are all by men, and there does seem to be a bit of kind of heterodouchery around and swagger around this idea of using other people's cultural material. I'm sure there are women artists who've been sued for copyright infringement as well, but certainly there are really interesting non-male artists who've made work around this. In particular, one of my favourite is Louise Lawler, who creates really amazing photographs of other artists' works that have been acquired and installed by high-end art collectors, and she'll name the photographs after the collectors rather than the artists in question. So it is possible to work within this space without risking getting sued. However, obviously it goes with the territory. Laws vary between countries, but frequently the matter comes down to whether or not the artist has made fair use of the imagery in question, which means it either needs to be reinterpreted in a very different way, or only be a small part of the original artwork that then becomes part of a large composition, or it needs to have been used to create a very different, noticeably different meaning. Or it can be commenting on it in some kind of, as a form of parody or critique. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to the meaning of the original artwork, but obviously in some cases it does. So a few really notable examples of this that have played out through very important lawsuits in recent decades. Oh, sorry, before I go to that, just to provide some local context, Arts Law Australia currently says copyright infringement occurs when copyright material is used in one of the exclusive ways controlled by the copyright owner without the copyright owner's permission. So, for example, putting someone else's image on a product and selling it. Infringement can also occur when a substantial part of the material is used. There are a number of exceptions to copyright infringement, including fair use for research, study, criticism, review, parody, satire, and reporting the news. And then it goes on to discuss some other exceptions. So you can see it's a very vague and quite subjective area. So some of these historical examples will illustrate that. So here we have two images relating to Rogers versus Coons, the lawsuit that took place in 1992. So on the left here we have a photograph by Art Rogers that was reproduced on a number of postcards and other products. Jeff Coons took one of the postcards, gave it to his studio because, of course, Coons doesn't actually physically make any of his work, and asked them to interpret it, and they created the sculpture on the right as part of his banality show. In this case, Rogers took Coons to court and won. It was deemed that the artwork on the right was not transformative of the original image. A few years later, this is Blanche versus Coons from 2006. On the left, we have a photograph that was used for a Gucci advert. It's called Silk Sandals by Gucci by the photographer Andrea Blanche from 2000. And then Jeff Koons' Niagara from 2006, where he used the pair of legs. You can see they're the second one on the right. In this case, Blanche sued Coons, and Coons won because it was deemed that, I guess, the work had transformed the meaning of the original image, and I guess it's part of a wider composition. This is Coons' Seated Ballerina, I think it's called. Seated Ballerina from 2017 that was installed at the Rockefeller Centre. It's a huge, big inflatable. This was not subject to a court case. At the time it premiered in 2017, a number of people kind of raised the fact that it was a direct copy of a little figurine by a well-known East European artist, and Coons explained at that time that he had a licensing agreement to recreate it. So even Jeff Coons will change his ways if he's sued often enough. I quite like Coons, by the way. I think he's a really interesting artist. I'm sure he's a horrible human being. But I think he's a really interesting artist, and I think this work is beautiful. So Carew versus Prince, 2013. Richard Prince is an American artist and photographer who's built a career on appropriating other artists' work. For example, he had a show in 2014 where he would find images on people's Instagram feeds that he quite liked, and then he would post a really ambiguous comment, take a screenshot, and those images were blown up and printed and sold for up to $90,000 US each. Some of the people whose content he used were flattered and said they were thrilled to be part of it, and some people were less impressed. But this court case took place in 2013, a year before that show. Patrick Carew published a book of photographs documenting Rastafarian culture called Yes Rasta. It sold in limited numbers and earned him around $8,000 at the time. And I think that was in 2000. I think it was 2000. In 2008, Richard Prince reworked a number of the images, I think about 25 or 30 of the images, for an exhibition called Canal Zone. And the works from that show sold for up to $2 million each, and there were varying levels of intervention on his behalf. So Carew took him to court and won. Prince then countersued, and a number of the images, the ruling was reversed on them. So this is one where the photographer, Prince won. So on the left you see the image from the book. On the right you can see what Prince did with it, and you can see it's only sort of a hint of the dreadlocks to the left of the centre of the image. In this case, the original ruling was maintained. So Carew's image on the left, and then Prince's version of it on the right. And in this case, the original image was the one that won out. The example of prints, and especially that Instagram show that I mentioned earlier, kind of indicates the space that we're operating within now, the way that the world and the way that visual culture exists in the 21st century. And to a certain extent, some of these arguments feel redundant because obviously images are put out there and stolen and reinterpreted and consumed at such a mind-boggling rate that really anyone who's willing to put work out into the public realm from a certain standpoint really can't argue when the image gets used in a particular way. However, I think that doesn't stand in post-colonial countries such as Australia, and certainly globally in the wake of the Me Too and BLM movements. I think these arguments have become very relevant and urgent again. I did quite a lot of reading about the Carew versus Prince lawsuit last week leading up to this lecture, and something that struck me was that not one article I read highlighted the fact that the original images that both of these white artists were using were of black bodies and Rastafarian culture. And for me, that's a far more pertinent and problematic area, regardless of how much money the white artists were making out of this work. And I think those type of considerations are really important in an Australian context. So I wanted to quickly discuss a few examples of recent Australian art history where these issues have come to the forefront. So here we have a work by the Indigenous artist Eddie Burup from 1997, and this is a diptych that was called In the Beginning Genesis 1 by his gallery. But the artist's title was All That Old Dreamin' Mob, halfway from coming out. So senior Kimberley elder Eddie Burup emerged in the Indigenous art market in the early 1990s, I think 93 or 94, and he was an immediate sensation because his work didn't look like any art coming out of the Kimberley at that time. He was recognised for having a really unique vision. He was curated into major exhibitions, including an Adelaide Festival show at the Tadanya Institute in 1996, and that same year he was shortlisted for the 13th NATSIA Awards, the National Indigenous Art Awards. If you're asking yourself why you've never heard of Eddie Burup, if you haven't heard of Eddie Burup, the reason for that is that this is Eddie Burup. Elizabeth Durack, up until that point, highly respected white Australian female artist. Elizabeth Durack was the daughter of one of the major pastoral dynasties of the Kimberley. She had grown up in the Kimberley region, surrounded by Aboriginal people. She was friends with many Aboriginal people from the region. She built a career on painting them, and those paintings were always quite well regarded in terms of Australian art. Looking at them now, they're quite problematic, and they fit within that sort of mid-20th century, very racially patronising school of art. They're sort of images of little Aboriginal kids with big eyes, the type of work that you saw in a lot of tourist product by artists like Brownie Downing, the type of work that artists today like Tony Albert make work criticising. So her practice was kind of problematic, but became infinitely more problematic when she invented Eddie Burup. So she, when she was around 80 years of age, she was struck with inspiration and created a body of work that she signed with the name Eddie Burup. From her perspective, when you read about her discussions of it, it's kind of as though she felt she was channeling someone, and that having grown up in the Kimberley, surrounded by Aboriginal people, she felt that she had a level of understanding that made this type of art practice acceptable, and I guess she felt she was creating a kind of hybrid of Australian and Aboriginal and non-Indigenous art styles. Understandably, there was a lot of outrage and anger surrounding this when it came to light that Eddie Burup was an elderly white lady. The Aboriginal curator at the MCA at the time, John Mundine, described the fraud as a total obscenity and said It's the last thing left that you, meaning white Australians, could possibly take away from us other than our lives. Eddie Burup's work had been collected by major galleries, who then, uncollected it. Obviously, he was kicked out of the Nazis. Durack went to her grave. She died around 8 or 9 years later. She never admitted any wrongdoing and never understood what the fuss was about. And from her perspective, she was painting under a nom de plume. And as I mentioned before, sort of felt that she was creating really interesting hybrid work. A slightly more recent example from 2008 were these works by Lucas Grogan. This is a really low quality image. Many of the works that I'm showing here, not surprisingly, there are not high quality versions of them online. This one is quite awkward for me because Lucas is a friend of mine. He does not make work in this style anymore. If he did, I would maybe feel less inclined to be friends with him. He created this series of work in the style of the Arnhem Land Raak bark paintings in 2008. He was in his early 20s at the time. He was 23, I think. He launched this body of work at his commercial gallery, and there was intense public outcry because obviously the works were very reminiscent of a particular style of Indigenous art. He was kicked out of Sydney Contemporary. Many artists who were in exhibitions with him or who showed with his commercial galleries withdrew from projects or left the galleries in question. And yeah, he immediately stopped making work like this. He's since built a very successful career for himself. Part of the controversy around this work, apart from the fact that obviously it was appropriating a style of Indigenous work, is that the figures in question, which you may not be able to see in this image, were engaged in illicit activities. So drinking, engaging in gay sex, vomiting. This is all subject matter that Lucas has always referenced in his work. However, of course, in this case, they're black bodies, undeniably, and they're painted in a style that was very specific to a very sacred form of Indigenous art making that depicts spirit figures. So that kind of makes the issue even more complex. As I said, Lucas is a friend of mine, and so I'm inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. And from my perspective, Lucas worked as a gallery attendant at one of the major state galleries that had a major survey of this work a couple of years prior. So I think he probably recognised that the style of mark making in this work was very similar to his own practice, which it is. And he certainly understood the subject matter well. And again, much like Durack, I think he felt that this was creating a really interesting kind of hybrid art practice that brought together different strands of Australian art that had not been brought together before. I would encourage all of you to read a really fascinating article that Darren Jorgensen wrote about this scandal that was in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Art in 2019. And Darren looked more deeply at the history of the bark paintings in question and the imagery that Lucas used. And I think looks more deeply at them and discusses kind of this history of white people approaching that work and appreciating it and trying to comment on it. So, as with the Durack scandal, there was a huge amount of outcry about this work, but there were also a lot of non-Indigenous people who didn't really understand what the fuss was all about, and it was quite distressing researching this in the last couple of weeks and looking at online forums and articles that are online about both Durack and this body of work by Lucas Grogan. Just the comments people post still today, a lot of white people don't have an issue with this or don't understand why it's problematic. At the time that these works premiered and there was the outcry against them, a Canadian First Nations artist, a Métis artist, David Garneau, was asked to comment on them, and he sums up the problematic aspects of it far more eloquently than I could when he said, "Some Aboriginal artists appropriate Western art styles to deconstruct colonialism. Given that they were forcibly assimilated into that culture, they clearly have the right and duty to talk back in the master's voice as well as their own. The reverse, however, is not equitable." Mic drop. Yeah, and in terms of thinking about equity and thinking about what all the fuss is about, I think it's important to acknowledge that obviously the cultural implications of using artistic languages that other cultures have made their own is highly problematic, but there's also an economic aspect to this. Some really important work that's being done in Australia at the moment is in relation to inauthentic Indigenous product. And these are some of the images from the advertising campaign that the Indigenous Art Code and Arts Law have put out. So 2/3 of Aboriginal souvenirs on the marketplace currently are fakes created in Indonesia and other places by non-Indigenous artists. This comprised 60% of the full tourist spend in the financial year 2019-2020. So that was approximately $250 million spent by people who thought they were buying work made by Aboriginal Australians. And that's more than double the spend on authentic Aboriginal art from art centres in that year. It's probably not quite double the spend on Aboriginal art in general, but in terms of product coming out of art centres, who are probably the entities who could most benefit from really high quality, authentic tourist product, it's pretty depressing. So finally, and possibly controversially, I wanted to highlight the fact that cultural appropriation is not solely limited to race and ethnicity. Here we have an image of Marcus Canning's Rainbow. Again, an artwork I quite like, I hasten to add. However, I and a number of other queer people have been kind of confused by this work and the rhetoric around it. So there's been something of a deafening silence regarding the implications of using rainbow imagery in a major public artwork. Marcus Canning's artist statement for this work talked about the rainbow as being a universal symbol of hope and joy and so on, which it undeniably is. And similarly, the City of Fremantle, who commissioned and own this work, and own this wonderful facility, who I'm very grateful to be hosted by, all of the official statements published by the City of Fremantle about this work talked about its universal appeal, but not once did anyone mention the significance of rainbows to queer people. The launch of this work in 2016 also coincided with the ramping up of the same-sex marriage debate. So even though I'm not saying it was anything the artist or the city intended, this artwork became kind of an icon of that debate in Western Australia and probably nationally. There were rallies held in front of it and it was on everyone's Instagram. And I just think it's very strange that that's never been acknowledged. Like, yes, queer people do not own the rainbow in the same way that Aboriginal people from Central Australia do not own dots. However, I think it's everyone knows that the rainbow has a very specific, highly politicised meaning to a very marginalised group of people, and I maintain you don't see a lot of heterosexual men walking down the street decked out in rainbows. And that's because everyone knows that it means something. And for I don't know, the context of a town that is so amazingly progressive as Fremantle is, I've always found it quite curious that it's never really been acknowledged. And other artists, like Brent Harrison, a really amazing young early career artist, made a show about this at Cool Change a couple of years ago, kind of questioning it in a very playful, light-hearted way. And the response of the artist was kind of intense. So that is everything that I wanted to say. In closing, I really hope my exhibition is not racist. And thank you all so much for your attention and for coming out tonight.